Hello, we begin with breaking news out of Hong Kong, where the territory's Beijing-appointed leader has announced that a controversial extradition bill is dead. Carrie Lam admitted that her government's work on the proposed law had been a total failure. The bill would have allowed the extradition of criminal suspects to mainland China. Anger over the bill led to unprecedented protests. And earlier this month, hundreds of people broke away from peaceful demonstrations and stormed the city's legislature building. We'll be live from Hong Kong with our reporter just a moment. But first, let's hear what Carrie Lam had to say.
But there are still lingering doubts about the government's sincerity, or worries whether the government will restart the process in the Legislative Council. So I reiterate here, there is no such plan. The bill is dead.
Let's get reaction from Hong Kong and bring in Rob McBride. So Carrie Lam said that the bill is dead, but she stopped short of a formal withdrawal, Rob. Is this likely to appease the protesters?
That's right, Doreen. It remains to be seen if they will be mollified by this. There is so much unrest because of this bill. What they have been demanding, of course, is the complete withdrawal of this legislation. That's what they've been demanding on these massive marches. Now, when last month Carrie Lam said that this bill had been suspended, a lot of her government ministers were briefing the media saying effectively that killed the bill. So she hasn't actually said much more. She has used the word kill herself, which I suppose technically is important. But then, as protesters here would argue, this is only her government and the current legislature. It doesn't say that a future government or a future Beijing-appointed, effectively, chief executive might try to reintroduce this. I think given the strength of feeling on the streets of Hong Kong, it was always clear that it wasn't going to be reintroduced anytime soon. But Carrie Lam is only in power potentially for the next few years, and it may well be that a future government, a future chief executive will try and reintroduce this in the future. Doreen?
And interestingly, Rob, one of the demands of the protesters throughout the protests has in fact been Carrie Lam's resignation, but we haven't seen that happen.
That's right, her resignation. One of the other demands, probably more pressing and more important to a lot of people here, effectively, if Carrie Lam resigns, that doesn't mean very much for most protesters here. She will be replaced by effectively another pro-Beijing chief executive. It won't mean that much difference in the way that this government listens to Beijing. It's effectively controlled from central government. But one thing protesters have been demanding is a full independent investigation into the police handling of these demonstrations. The protesters, of course, they say that the police have used excessive force. Now, the Carrie Lam stopped short of that. She has said that there will be an investigation of all the policing by the IPCC, that's the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Now, according to many critics of the establishment and the police, this body is far from independent. They want to see a full independent investigation. She has not committed the government to that.
And what do we make of the timing of her announcement, Rob? Is there something to be said about why she's come out and made the statement now?
I think the government all along has been really forced into making these concessions very grudgingly. That's one of the criticisms of Carrie Lam's leadership style, is what people see as basically her obstinacy. But effectively, she has Beijing behind her, and Beijing will presumably, will be resistant to the Hong Kong government being seen to be giving away to these mass protests. It's a huge loss of face. And of course, it's taken these mass protests just to get this far, just to get the government say, yes, all right, the bill is suspended. Now to say, for Carrie Lam to say, yes, all right, the bill is killed, all as a way of trying to take some of the acrimony out of these protests. It remains to be seen, though, whether that's going to have any effect, because more and more you are seeing a whole series of upcoming events. Effectively, for many people here, the genie is now out of the bottle. People aren't just talking about the extradition bill, and they're talking about the wider issue of Hong Kong's relationship with China, the old subject of universal suffrage. Why can't we vote for a government of our choice and a leader of our choice? Why is it effectively chosen by Beijing? There are more protests upcoming. It remains to be seen whether this will have any effect on trying to reduce the numbers of protesters on the streets.
And Rob, just one final question since I have you with us. Tell us how all of these protests over the past number of weeks have affected daily life in Hong Kong and people's movements around the city.
It's a very good question. It depends in which political camp you are. There are an awful lot of people here, of course, who are very conservatively minded, who don't see any value, any upside in trying to take on China and trying to take on Beijing. Beijing, as they will tell you, will never be seen to be giving away to protesters in the streets. It just isn't China's style. China will be very worried about looking at the other cities throughout China, that if it gives concessions to Hong Kong, it may cause problems elsewhere. So there's a lot of people here who don't go along with this protest movement. There's a lot of businesses that have said that their businesses have suffered, that maybe tourism numbers have dropped off. So it is a very divisive issue. But as I mentioned, there are more protests upcoming, and in particular, instead of the mass protests that we've been seeing, far more targeted and in a way potentially nastier protests in some parts of the New Territories and Kowloon coming up this weekend. Doreen?
OK, Rob McBride giving us the update from Hong Kong. Rob, thank you. Let's now speak to Joseph Cheng. He's a pro-democracy campaigner. He's joining us via Skype from Hong Kong as well. Thanks very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Carrie Lam is now saying that the Hong Kong bill is dead. Does this mean that the protesters' demands have been met?
It has been met in a small way. This declaration certainly is to be welcomed, but she still refuses to start an independent investigation into alleged police violence, which will certainly disappoint the young people, the student unions, and the pro-democracy movement. There's a lot of hostility towards the police, and the police itself is quite frustrated. Certainly, Carrie Lam has demonstrated a more modest, a more humble attitude. She intends to win over the less committed, the middle-of-the-roaders. But I do believe that the vast majority of Hong Kong people now want better guarantees that the government is going to be accountable to them, to stand up for their interests, and to avoid and prevent too many interferences from Beijing. This is a rather tall order, but she has to restore that confidence and trust in her government. Otherwise, her government will be rather ineffective in the coming 3 years. So
what are you saying then? What does this mean for the protesters and the movement going forward? Because we were just hearing from our correspondent, Rob McBride, in Hong Kong, who was saying that more protests are still expected.
Yes, there will be more small-scale protests, like one being planned in a new town, Sha Tin, in the New Territories this Sunday, and another in another new town, Zheng Guan O, in the following Sunday. Apparently, the pro-democracy movement, and especially the young people, are dissatisfied with this kind of attitude, that is to say, too little concessions, too few concessions, too late, and being squeezed, being pressured. Then she will make a little concession. I think this kind of strategy, this kind of ethics, this kind of tactics are counterproductive. You don't handle a crisis this way. Now she has to simply win the trust of the Hong Kong people, and apparently she has failed to do so. She is counting on Beijing support, and with Beijing support, the pro-establishment camp will have to support her.
All right, we'll leave it there. We thank you very much, Joseph Cheng, for speaking to us from Hong Kong.
Thank you.